We are joined by the authors of Hail Mary, The Rise and Fall of the National Women's Football League, Britni de la Cretaz and Lyndsey D'Arcangelo. Thank you guys so much for being here today. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having us.
So I'm a notorious female sports fan on the show. I talk about sports to a degree that I think half our audience isn't that into. But I'm really embarrassed to say that I knew until reading your book very little about the National Women's Football League. Frankly, the only time I've seen women play football on TV was that, growing up, I would have NFL Network on, and they had that lingerie football league on, which at the time even as a kid, I went, there's something wrong here. I mean, what inspired you both to write this book? And I guess from a big picture view, what are your reflections on women's relationship to football in modern American culture?
I will say that you should not be embarrassed, because I know women's sports historians that have never heard of this league. So I think that that's pretty common. We did not know about this league either. And we came across it while researching a larger women's football project. We were trying to write a book about women in football much more broadly. And that book didn't sell. It didn't have much of a narrative arc. But in looking into that, we discovered the NWFL and the Toledo Troopers, the winningest team in pro football history. And in digging into their record, we found they were playing other teams, but we could not find anything else about those teams or about that league. And I think it became very quickly clear that this was the book that we wanted to write. And so we went from there. And I think, in terms of big picture thoughts about women's football, that's a big question. But I will say, for me, and Lyndsey may have something different to add here, but what was most surprising to me about writing this book was about how little has changed when it comes to the landscape of women's football, and how the leagues that are operating today are still operating very much in the vein of the way that the NWFL operated, on these shoestring budgets, selling raffle tickets to play games, not getting any money to be on the field and things like that. And so I think for me, that was the most jarring, was really how little progress there has been in some ways.
Yeah, I'd have to agree with that sentiment. Seeing the similarities and some of the same struggles and hurdles that women's football players and leagues and teams have to deal with today was kind of jarring.
Yeah, and what struck me really is in reading your book, how there's a kind of post-Title IX shift a little bit, but it doesn't really apply to football, right? I mean, tackle football is perceived as aggressive, and aggression is not incentivized as a quality for women and girls. And I can say this in terms of politics a little bit. There are very few women in my field, because I think that there's a lot of times, or in progressive media specifically, because I think a lot of times speaking your mind to that degree about politics can be perceived as aggressive. There have been gains made in soccer or in tennis for women and girls, not enough, but that's because they're more aerobic and less strength based. And then that's some of the inherent misogyny in it as well, I would say. The aggression, strength building, that's more masculine, and that should not be something that women engage in. I'm curious about your thoughts on my read of those dynamics.
Yeah, that's exactly it. And we talk about this a lot when we're discussing the book and the players and the league itself. There's this view in society, because football, like you said, is such a aggressive and violent sport, a very masculine coded sport, that society has a hard time wrapping their minds around women playing it, especially at the professional level. And, basketball, soccer, those sports that you mentioned, they're very much finesse sports. I mean, yes, there's physicality involved, but they're more, free flowing. And I don't know if that's more easily digestible for society, but yeah, we completely agree.
Right, because I mean, there was a passage in your book about some of the misogynistic ways that in the 1930s, I believe there was an over 200-pound offensive lineman, female, was written about. What were some of the things that you found when you're deep research on this? Because there was not a breadth of material at your disposal. Like, you can't just go on, whatever Pro Football Reference or the NFL database to find some of the stats that you need to see. You had to get a lot of firsthand accounts from people.
Yeah, we did. And a lot of our research, the beginning of our research comes from the newspapers, because these leagues and these teams were considered a curiosity. And so all the way back through history, in the 1930s, like you noted, there was some organized women's football being played. And those games, as well as the NWFL games, were covered very much as a curiosity. And the longer that the NWFL went on, the less media coverage there was. And the league was covered very much with a focus on the women's appearance. If they were very, very large women, that was played up. There was a lot of fat phobia and comments about the weight of, the linebackers. Or the linemen, excuse me. We had, if they were attractive, that was played up as well, because there is something threatening to the status quo about more masculine women. And so it was very important for reporters to play up when women were attractive so that they weren't seen as too threatening. And there was also this focus on the players being, women's libbers, because this is during the 70s, during second wave feminism. And so even though the players themselves didn't really associate with the movement, you see the newspapers really trying to shoehorn that in, and asking questions about their male partners and things like that. And so that coverage really is done through the lens of the people who are writing about it. And the people who were writing about it then were largely men. And so a lot of the research that we did came firsthand and from materials that the players had held on to. And we tried really to get their perspective back in, because it had been so thoroughly erased by the media at the time.
So I want to talk about, the NWFL's origins, but first I just kind of want to back up to talk about football's origins, because part of why this topic is important, it's not just women's sports in general, but the NFL is the most popular sport in our country, or football is. It is a cultural staple. I mean, that's part of why I enjoy it. I love the collectivism of it and the collective experience. But of course, that comes with like a massive exclusionary element, because the 50% of the population have not, roughly, have been historically excluded from that, both culturally and as players. So take us back to the late 1800s. Women's interest in football predates the NWFL, or NWFL, right, as you write.
Yeah, I mean, throughout our research, we discovered and found many examples of women participating in playing football, or trying to organize teams, and actually getting a few teams off the ground and having little round robins themselves throughout the course of history since the sport was invented. The late 1800s, as you referenced, there was a game between Yale and what was the other school? I think it was Harvard.
Yale.
Harvard, Yale. And they were putting on a men's social club event, and they gathered women from each school and pinned the school colors on them and had them play sort of like an exhibition game for fun and for entertainment for the guys. But when the women actually got on the field to play, I mean, they took it extremely seriously, and the game started, getting a little rough, and the police had to be called in because the crowd was getting really excited, and the whole description, in the newspaper at the time, could read like a scene out of a movie. And that just showcased really that early on that women, found interest in the sport and could play when given the opportunity. And so from there on, up until the NWFL kicked off, there were many times, as I said before, of women who tried to play, at high schools, or just, there was a high schooler in Alabama who went out for her team as a kicker at 17 years old, just to prove that she could. I mean, we could go back through and name a ton. And then eventually in the 1960s, there was a man by the name of Sid Friedman. He was a promoter and quote unquote sports agent for a baseball player. And he saw this sort of curiosity and the novelty of women's football, women playing football sort of growing and catching on. And he decided just to create a team akin to the Harlem Globetrotters, women's football team, women's football troop, really, to play and compete against men teams around the Rust Belt area. He was from Cleveland, Ohio. And he got a team off the ground. And when he put out word in the newspaper to have these women, to have women come try out, he got so many women who were interested, and not only interested, they really wanted to play and have the opportunity to play. And he formed a team, and they did play other men's teams, and they held their own. And so he decided to create another women's team, and then another women's team. And he sort of had this conglomerate of teams playing against each other throughout Pennsylvania and in Cleveland and in Buffalo, around those areas. And that's really what served as the launching pad for the NWFL, because owners around the country were honing in on this and decided to start teams in different parts of the country, and eventually got together separate of Sid Friedman to form the NWFL. But yeah, that's really sort of the timeline progression.
So that does hit on another point that I wanted to touch on, which is so there were capitalists, eventually owners, that saw that this could be profitable, or thought that this could be, but it seems like, at least in the origin of the idea, only as a kind of spectacle a la Harlem Globetrotters, as you say. What did you find in some of your research there, and what these owners and capitalists thought would be the best way for them to get profit out of any women's league?
Yeah, so I think that women's football, the men who started these teams, as you said, it really was a gimmick. And someone like Sid Friedman, who was a promoter, he's had this huge influence on the game of women's football, and it wouldn't exist today without his vision. But at the same time, he was really in it to make money, and he did not really care as much about how the women were represented in the press and how he was going to do it. If it was going to make him money, he was in. And so for him, having these women wear potentially like tearaway skirts, and he would, send photographers from Hustler magazine to practices, and they'd like get under the center to try to get photographs, things like that. He just saw it as part of promoting this outfit that he, this vision that he had, and whatever it took. And so there was a very like exploitative element to that. And the reason that many of the women broke off and decided to go independent was because they did not want to be exploited, and they wanted to be taken seriously as football players. However, what Sid Friedman and many of the male owners of the NWFL teams, there were some player-owned teams, but most were owned by men. The thing that they failed to realize was that any sports league takes a long time to become profitable, and there has to be a lot of time and investment before there's ever like a return on that money. And a lot of these men, some of them really wanted to see the women's game take off, and others really were in it to make a quick buck. They thought they could bring this to their town, their city, and people would come and they would see profits, within a year or two. Not only is that really just like not how any sports league functions, most take about 10 years to see any profit.
Yeah.
Women's teams in particular, and like a brand new team, often take longer because they're up against, the sexism and the belief that they can't play, and they just don't get the same. And so the NWFL itself was really never given a chance to fully succeed, because a lot of the men who had invested, when they didn't see profits right away, they either ran out of money or they weren't willing to put any more in.
And being unwilling to put, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. You can keep going.
No, I was done.
Oh, okay. No, the being unwilling to stick it out, that is like, that's got to be that's something that's so embedded with misogyny in and of itself, right? Because I think for owners in more established leagues, the owning an all-male team is a point of pride. You're more willing to, like, I mean, we saw this through the pandemic. Owners took a hit in the NFL because in many stadiums there weren't any fans, but like they stick it out not because of the quick buck element, but because they understand that owning a sports team in one of the 32 teams in the country is it's not like the number one thing you can do for profit, but you become a cultural staple in and of itself. And the unwillingness to stick it out. I mean, I'm curious if what your opinions were in terms of just, you know, that there's misogyny in that. And then it also perpetuates the misogyny in culture because the longevity is so fleeting, I guess, if that makes sense.
Yeah, the NWFL was up against so many factors, not having the time investment, not having the money investment, two main things that men's leagues are afforded and have always been afforded that women's leagues haven't. The fact that football is such we said earlier, a masculine coded sport. But then you also have the fact that the men's teams in the NFL had already been around for a while. There were already established fan bases. And then you had college football to that, where those fans travel and follow the players from college to the pros.
And so those players don't get paid to talk about another exploitative
system. So women's football players were up against all of that. You know, how can you expect fans to go to a game once and become invested in the Houston Hurricanes when they have no tie? There was no time to build up that fan base. And the fact that some of the owners didn't even consider that or weigh that as a factor. I mean, novelties wear off, you know, the curiosity of going to see women play a game, you know, that wears off after one or two games. And then you're like, okay. And that's sort of what happened. People moved on because the curiosity wore off. But, you know, you need that time to establish the fan base, and they just weren't given that.
And there's no infrastructure for women's football, right? I mean, I was just listening to a football podcast the other day about how many great quarterbacks and receivers are coming out on the draft because those are the stars. And like in high school games, quarterbacks are it's not like the old days where it's run game focused. Quarterbacks are throwing the ball 30, 40 times a game in high school games, and receivers are getting those reps. And so like, that's why you see all these high level quarterbacks and receivers coming out in the draft. It's not like this natural thing where there's just like human beings that are plucked and they're Joe Burrow or Patrick Mahomes exist. No, it's because there's infrastructure for those specific kinds of players. There's none of that for women, not just in football too. I mean, like it could be better in other sports, but you know, Matt, our producer, points out that little leagues have state funding. They can help in terms of fostering talent for baseball. There's none of that for women's football, and very little of that for women's sports in general.
Yeah. And if we think about the time period for the NWFL, if we talk about this league specifically, you know, they started in 1974. And we know Title IX was passed in 1972. And so most of the women who were playing in this league did not benefit from Title IX. So they really didn't have much of organized sports at all that they played coming up as kids. And many of these women were athletes, right? They loved the game of football. They grew up playing it with their brothers, with the neighborhood boys. They played pickup games, but that was their only exposure to organized football. And so you have fans come to what is being advertised and billed as a professional football game, and they're expecting NFL level talent. And the women were akin probably to a good high school team, but you know, that to just say that takes it out of the context of they're picking up this game as adults. They're learning the fundamentals as adults. And many of them, because they were lifelong athletes, are quick studies, but they have not had that same pipeline and that same investment in infrastructure. And I want to be very clear that it is not a talent gap. It is not because women are incapable of playing at the same level or, you know, that they lack skills. It's an investment gap, and it always has. And it's, you know, it still is that way. A lot of the women who play semi-pro football today, some of them will play as kids. You know, the number of girls who are playing organized football is going up, but the majority of the women playing in the semi-pro leagues, even today, they again come to the game as adults. They're lifelong athletes who discover that there's a football team and they always wanted to play. And so they show up. And so it is still exists today. There's absolutely a lack of infrastructure.
Yeah, and just to build on to what Britni just said, the pipeline, we're seeing a pipeline being created from those amateur women's football leagues, because some of the women coaching in the NFL today got their start playing in those leagues and getting that experience that men often say is required to coach at the college and pro level. And because they were actually on the field and got that experience, they were given opportunities at high schools, then colleges, and then eventually have landed in the NFL. So we're starting, we can see the possibility of a pipeline being established. And if that is developed even further back, you know, at the youth and then at the high school level, giving women an opportunity to get involved in the game and get exposed to the game at an even younger age, then that pipeline will grow. And I'm not necessarily talking about tackle football, because it doesn't have to be that. It can also be, it can just be flag football. It can be some sort of way that the rules of the game and the elements of the sport can still be there and exist.
Well,
So
in tennis,
you know,
yeah, I mean, it's like silly. In tennis, they only play 3 sets in women's tennis, and in men's they play 5. Like, there's not it's not an all or nothing proposition in terms of playing this game. There are different rules. The XFL has different rules. College football has different rules. Rules changes happen all the time, and they can be different for a women's league 100%. I wanted to ask your both of your opinions on homophobia's role in the NWFL not getting off the ground to the degree that it could. I mean, I'd imagine that there were a lot of gay players, or you did write that, and there was homophobic responses to them playing the sport. I mean, what was some of what you found in interviewing these former players, and also in terms of the archive research that you did?
Sure. I think, you know, we assumed there would be some players who were gay, and we didn't know how many would want to talk about it and whether they would see it as connected to their time in the league. And what we discovered was that many of the gay players who were in the NWFL really did see their queerness and their time in this league as very connected. And that is, you know, because there's estimates, you know, not every player was gay, of course, but somewhere between 50 to 70% of the teams were gay. And those women, some of them like knew each other from the local gay community. This is the 1970s. It is not as socially acceptable to be openly gay. So many of the players who were lesbians knew each other from their local bars. Some of them found out about the teams through their local bars where they organized softball leagues and things like that. And so in many ways, the teams they served as an extension of those communities. I think marginalized folks are really good at finding ways to create safety in a hostile world. And this is another example of that, is that the players really found a way to be together. And because there were so many of them, they could be openly who they were. However, they were also up against systemic and societal homophobia. And so there's a lot of fear of, you don't want to advertise yourself as, you know, being a lesbian. There were some teams who were afraid to allow the local lesbian bar to buy an ad space in the program because they were worried that they wouldn't be seen as family friendly if they were associated with that bar. Sometimes there would be homophobic slurs yelled at them while they were practicing. Some of the media coverage really wanted to paint them as a bunch of lesbians. And so they were really up against that. And I think we see that today, too. You know, the WNBA has long wrestled with a lot of homophobia as well and trying to counteract that. But I do think that the queer history of the 70s and of this league kind of can't be erased from the narrative of it as a whole.
Yeah, and I just wanted to dive a little bit more into how Title IX affected the NWFL, because it was created in 67. Title IX was 72, 73.
72.
I'm forgetting.
72.
72. And that was around the same time Billie Jean King had her Battle of the Sexes match, which was just recently immortalized in that movie with Emma Stone. But there were a lot of women's sports was front and center to a degree. How did that affect the NWFL?
Well, it's funny because some of the players knew about Title IX and were keeping up with what was happening in the country. And other players had no idea what it was, depending on who we talked to. When we did our research, we divided the teams in the league between each other. And so we each spoke to different players on different teams and researched different teams. So we had different experiences with who we interviewed. And so, but I think for the players that I spoke to that knew about Title IX, it opened up their sports world completely. And I do think it was a motivating factor in some of them wanting to give women's football a try, because throughout their lives, they were never really given an opportunity to explore sports. And a lot of them grew up playing football with their friends and their brothers and their families. And so given this opportunity to sort of try different sports, especially football, they jumped, feet first.
Yeah, I do think it is a little bit complicated, though, because a lot of these women were adults. And so the ones that were in college actually were the ones that got to benefit the most. But what I do think was really important about Title IX, and this is also where, the women's liberation movement comes in, is that what it did was it opened up this like societal conversation and readiness and awareness around women playing sports. And I think it created the atmosphere for a league like the NWFL to start, because it was something that was in the news, as you said, with Battle of the Sexes and things like that. So it was on people's radar. And I think women were able to participate in sports in a way they hadn't before. And I would credit the conversation around Title IX and women's liberation with that.
And lastly, there's really just something, and I'm curious about your read on this, both of you, because hockey is a sport that's also very brutal, right? And I think women's hockey has made more gains. I know that because the United States is women's hockey team is pretty good. I've heard, I watched the Olympics 4 years ago when they were in it and winning a bunch of medals. And I know that like some just anecdotally, some people I know are interested in watching that, but there's really no because American football is so American and there's not much internationalism to it. It also comes with all of the pitfalls of our like inherently misogynistic culture. Do you think that the Americanness of American football, it sounds redundant, but it's true, contributes to the inherent misogyny in the sport? Or not inherent, but the adopted misogyny, I guess.
I think that has a lot to do with it. Again, like just saying that society at large has a hard time wrapping their minds around women playing tackle football with full-on pads and helmets and being that physical. It seems that it's just the same hurdle that women's football leagues today, the amateur leagues, just haven't been able to get over and really, gain a foothold into the fan, into even breaking into regular football fans who watch the NFL in college. You mentioned hockey, and there's no checking in women's hockey, but it still is an aggressive sport. It really doesn't take away from some of the physicality and everything, but there could be modifications to the women's game, maybe to make it more appetizing. I don't know. I don't even know if that's something they would want to do, but just giving a comparison as to what possibly could be done to just maybe help make the sport a little more digestible, to try to bring in more fans.
Right. Well, I mean, there are a variety of things that can be done. It's just the impossibility of it is, I overstated, and I think your book lays that out really well. So thank you guys so much for being here today. Lyndsey D'Arcangelo and Britni De La Creta, thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.